Right. Good morning, good afternoon, and if anybody is still up from Asia Pacific, good evening. Glad that you can join us today for the slightly delayed, we had a few technical problems last week, webinar from Nigel Legg, who throughout the run-up and then during the week at the Festival of NewMR was monitoring the buzz, and he's going to tell you about what he discovered, what he found out, then a little bit about the implications and the takeaways from that, and then we can throw that open to questions as well. So with no more ado, I'll hand it over to Nigel.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So I'll just go straight in. So I used the search term NewMR to find posts about the festival. I'm going to be talking mainly about the period of the 7th and 8th of December, the day before and the day of the main stage. In terms of coverage, we got posts from Twitter, Facebook, blogs. We looked at forums, but there wasn't anything there, and of course the newmr.org site. There were some other sites, including some company sites, which also had posts. So, tools used. Alterian SM2 was the main tool for finding posts. In my opinion, it's the most reliable of the paid-for social media monitoring systems. I also used a C++ Qt program for doing some offline counts, which I'll come to in a minute. So, in this period, the 7th and 8th of December, there were 1,048 posts, 123 posts on the 7th of December, and 925 on the 8th of December. This shows a massive peak in posting about this term for the main stage event, and in all this, Twitter was massively dominant. The discussion pages on the NewMR site weren't used very much relatively. So a quick overview of the tweets sent. 51.67% of the tweets were clean. In other words, they weren't at mentions or retweets. 17.5% were retweets. So people were making their own comments about what was going on rather than retweeting what other people were saying. In terms of the top tweeters, LoveStats posted 159 tweets through the course of these 2 days. Prashari made 94 tweets, and Curiously P made 51. So there was quite a big gap between the top and the third tweeter, and there was a lot of people between about 25 and 50. So does this suggest that LoveStats was influential? Well, if you look at the number of retweets that that account got and the number of mentions that it got, possibly, but I'm still dubious about whether you can gauge influence from these kinds of things, these kinds of measures. So on to the next slide. Okay, this keyword cloud is produced from Alterian SM2. A lot of you'll notice that the top row and a half are all Twitter usernames. These are from the retweets and the mentions that were coming through. There's also a lot of people's names mentioned because they were mentioned as a result of talking about the presentations they made. You'll see that no one methodology dominates this. There's no highlighted term for qual or quant or so on, although in fact quant doesn't appear in the cloud. Qual does, survey does, technology, but there was a lot of general chatter around the search term, which kind of submerged the discussion about methodologies, though they were mentioned quite a lot through the conversation. Okay, I separated the posts out into categories, and I looked at 3 of them in detail. The category Tom Ewing was created by selecting all the tweets and other posts that mentioned Tom Ewing with a space and also at Tom Ewing, his username, and the same for Annalise Verhaeghe and Bernie Malinoff. So SM2 measures of sentiment were used to explore the content of the tweets and other posts in terms of the 3 measures of sentiment that SM2 uses: brand mentions, which is sentiment towards a search term, in this case NewMR; content tone, which is the overall negative or positive of the post; and content emotion, which goes into a bit more detail. So, for example, the category Tom Ewing had 30 mentions of words which were about leisure, mainly due to the presence of variations of the word game. His presentation was about using games in market research. Well, there's also, Ray, could you put that chart up? Ray?
The chart should be with you now.
The next chart down in the report. I think it's the next one down. Yeah, that one. That's good. You'll also see that there are 4 mentions of sexual terms. If you look at these in detail, they are actually mentions of love. I love the virtual NewMR Virtual Festival. I loved that presentation. So not actually sexual. Some of the categories I looked at had mentions of death. These were things like, I'm really enjoying it, I hope I don't starve to death during the festival. These emotion, content emotion scores give you a way of looking into the text that you have in more detail and guide your analysis. If I get back to
Should we go back to the slide?
yeah, can we go back to the slide?
You may need to click on it.
Yeah. Oops, I've gone too far.
There we are.
So you have, using these 3 different methods of sentiment of assigning sentiment, you have 3 different layers that you can go through to work out what people are saying and how people are talking about the term that you're searching for. And using categories, you can also split out your texts into various sections, which allows you to analyze it further. So the main thing that we found was that though there were discussion pages set up on the NewMR site, people still use Twitter. So people will use the platform or tool they are happy using, rather than be directed to something else. Maybe if Twitter hadn't been an option, people would have used the discussion pages more. The second point I'd like to make is that it's difficult to analyze the response to a particular presentation when the presenters themselves are taking part in the conversation. So it was difficult to see what people were saying about Tom Ewing's presentation, for example, because Tom himself was commenting on other people's presentations. And when people were commenting on Tom's presentation, they would use his Twitter username, but they'd also use that for other bits of conversation around the main stage event. In some senses, this is an unreal example because it only uses a single search term. If you were to be doing social media research for a client, you'd probably have the client name and a couple of brand names. In a recent study I did, there were, I think, 15 brand names. So it's more diverse from the start. And also, my involvement in the NewMR festival could potentially be seen by some people to have ethical issues in that I'm part of the conversation and I'm also analyzing that conversation. Two other things that I came across which were potential issues. The first is that all tweets that are returned have a date and time stamp of Pacific time. So all the tweets around the first session, Asia Pacific time session, actually came out as being on the 7th and not the 8th, which is why in this final report I picked the 7th and the 8th. And the second one was that until the Monday, I wasn't picking up any posts from newmr.org because even though it's a Ning site, it doesn't include Ning in the URL, so SM2 wasn't picking it up. So you have to be careful to add in these custom URLs into SM2 to make sure that you get the full range of the data. Okay. Thank you much for listening.
Thank you, Nigel. Okay, let us throw that open to questions if people have got any sort of queries and thoughts. I've probably got one to kick the ball off with, Nigel. You talked about searching Facebook. I thought Facebook was quite difficult to search. So how was it able to do that? Was it just the public pages?
Public pages, and it depends on the user's privacy settings. So if you set your posts on your wall to be public and have no privacy whatsoever, then SM2 can find them. It's not 100% because it depends on the user.
Yeah.
Open public groups can be found as well, but there wasn't a public group for this event and this tag.
Yeah.
So LinkedIn, sadly, all the groups are pretty much hidden.
Right. Question here. Any particular rationale for using SM2? Is it price? Is it performance? Learning curve?
All of I used Radian 6 last year, and I found that it was missing out a lot of mainstream news, whereas SM2 doesn't. SM2 is somewhat cheaper. it's a system that I'm happy using. I feel it brings in everything that I need it to bring in, and it's got a nice way of analyzing things. Radian 6 doesn't have any sentiment analysis of any kind. Well, it's got a system whereby you can code things with sentiment, but if you've got a large data set, that takes up a lot of time, makes it more difficult. I'm not saying that the sentiment in SM2 is good, but I think the content emotion and content scores are fairly good. They're useful, though you do get oddities with it. It's a system I'm happy using. I wouldn't say it is definitely the best. It's the best for me.
What about regional coverage? So does SM2 have a global stretch, or does it tend to focus on English-speaking locations?
It's got a global stretch, global reach. I set it to posts in English because I don't have anyone working with me at the moment who can help me to translate other languages. But you can use it for German, French,
yeah,
Italian, Japanese, whatever. So.
And SM2, does this work like some of the others, that it has got a catalogue of sites that its crawlers maintain and watch, and then you can add specific URLs to that?
They've got a massive database. You can go back to 2006 and find tweets and Identica and whatever through searching their database. And they keep that updated on a daily, hourly basis.
Just while they're thinking about questions, Nigel, I'm going to come back to this point about love and sex. Is that something that you could, if you were doing a project for a client and you realize, well, that's a little bit spurious, can you reconfigure SM2 to not include love as one of the words inside sex, or to add a new category?
Yes, you can. Yes. It's got a thesaurus of words, and you can change things there. Most often, most of the times I've used this, I've found that, for example, the category anger is very useful because people say I'm annoyed with a supplier for whatever reason, and that comes out as anger. So it's a good way of if you're using social media monitoring for customer service, for example, it's a useful tool for finding people who are not happy with things.
That moves us to one of those ethical areas, because one of the great uses of these tools for clients is to find people that they should contact directly. Certainly people who are unhappy. I was reading a paper only last night on positive and negative word of mouth people. You can see why marketeers might want to access every positive word of mouth person and reinforce them, and every negative word of mouth person to go the opposite direction. And that's quite a long way from what market researchers would normally do. But we're using the same software platform and many of the same methods.
Yes, I mean, Reen's talk about the super promoters.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether that's market research or where it actually fits in. because it's finding the influencers to make use of them in a marketing campaign. Very, very interesting, and I'd be very interested in finding out how they define the influencers. Probably through a more qualitative method than I was trying to do there with the analysis of who was tweeting what, or who was tweeting and how, which was based purely on counts. Finding influencers is kind of a marketer's dream, finding the people who will be your brand advocates. So yes, it is different to market research, and it's in a way it's actively using market research immediately. You could look at it that way.
Yeah. It's certainly using the same skills.
Yes. Rather than waiting until the report has been produced, it's directly jumping in and doing something as soon as you find something.
Well, I've got two more questions. I guess the first one is the flip side of each other. Thinking about the clients you've worked with, what have they been their biggest disappointments? What did they expect to get from social media monitoring that isn't really there yet?
One client had a product recall in September, and I did a 2-month audit of social media, and the only posts about their product and their brand name were about how messy it was to work with. It's a construction product, so there was nothing about the product recall. There was no negative or positive mentions of their product in that sense. So they really didn't have to do anything in social media they wanted to know whether their reputation had been harmed, and it certainly hadn't in social media. So that was a bit disappointing for them. I think that's quite a good example.
Yes, absolutely. It makes them probably a little bit worried about whether the recall notice actually got to the people it needed to get to.
Well, I think that a lot of their customers are just people who aren't on social media. Yep. It's used in some pretty major construction projects, but the majority of the posts on social media were for people renovating their own homes.
Yep.
So it kind of helped them to segment where people are talking about things in that sense.
Yeah, it's useful for those of us who spend a large amount of our life on social media to remember that most of the people don't, I guess. So the flip side of that question, could you give a really good illustration of something that did work well, that delighted, surprised, or was useful?
I mentioned this to you before the seminar. During the election campaign, I was doing some monitoring for the my local Labour candidate, and he found a lot of stories that he was able to use in blogs as a result of social media monitoring, and his views on his blog went from, I think, 50 a day to 450 during the campaign. He didn't win, but never mind.
Yeah, because he had more relevant things to say.
Yes, he had more relevant, more up-to-date things to say, and not just about politics, but about things that were happening in the constituency, in the university, and so on.
So if we were to flip that to a baked beans or an airline or a bank, they could actually start having a lot more dialogue about their place in society by using monitoring, rather than just using it for market research in the conventional sense.
Right.
If they were to use it exactly the way you just described, they could end up with a more engaging relationship with people who visited and talked
Yes.
to them.
Yes. I cite that example because the candidate was actually using what I was giving him on a daily basis and feeding it back out to his supporters, his readers. If you use social media monitoring and don't act on it and don't then engage with the people who are reading what you're posting, there's no point.
Absolutely.
You have to.
Sorry.
You have if you are going to use what you're getting back to go back to your readers and give them more information or talk to them, you have to be ready to respond to what they're going to say, reply to you, and be very active about it. Yeah.
Right, well, if there are no more questions for anybody, I'd like to thank the people that attended. I'd like to thank you, Nigel, for getting up bright and early, because I know that you're in the US this morning, experiencing their lower temperatures. And I look forward to talking with you all again at some future point. So bye from me.
Thanks very much, and bye from me.